Okay, we'd love to make a start, I think, and keep carry on and keep us on in the background if you're still doing the survey, and we'll just begin with a few introductions and a little elaboration about how we're going to spend the next hour. My name's David Hudson. I work at the University of Birmingham in the International Development Department there, and my research mainly looks at questions of leadership, but also public opinion, which is how we came along to this issue, thinking about, and public opinion, it should be said, about global challenges that the world is facing. So I'd also like to invite my two fellow panelists to introduce themselves. So perhaps Nihir.
Hi, my name's Nihir Desandi. I'm a senior lecturer in the International Development Department at the University of Birmingham, so I work with David. My research focuses broadly on the politics of sustainable development and human rights, and within that, I specifically do some work on the health dimensions of climate change, and it's through that work that we ended up doing this project together. So that's the way I started doing this stuff with David and others.
And Camilla?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Camilla Tam. I am International Partnerships Manager at the Natural History Museum in London, which is the best museum in the world, if you weren't aware. I've been at the museum for about 7.5 years now, and that's predominantly been within public engagement. So really elevating the value of our scientific research. There are 300 scientists based at the museum, and the value of our collections to mainly public audiences, but other stakeholder audiences as well, which has been a lot of fun.
Excellent, thank you. And that very much reflects how we're going to run this evening. What we would like you to do first, and hopefully you've all managed to do this, is have a go at the experiment that we're going to talk about yourselves. And what we'll do at the end is we'll show you the results and perhaps reflect on whether they are similar to the representative samples we did in our survey, or whether they're different and why that is. And so Nihir and I will talk a little bit about the research side of it, and then we'll hand over to Camilla to reflect on a more practical practitioner, policymaker side, both reflecting on her experience recently at COP26, but all the work that the Natural History Museum does and the other partnerships that she's engaged with Wellcome and the UN as well. So it'll be a nice balance, I think, between the evidence and the implementation and efforts to do so. All right, well, let's keep going. So, framing climate change, what inspires us to care? This will be the page that you saw when you signed up. And thank you for that. And it's interesting, we were asked to choose an image for our event, which actually I think is a really nice way of perhaps getting into this idea of what do we mean by framing climate change. And, you know, the image here is of a cracked earth, a scorched earth, and the environmental consequences, or one of the environmental consequences of climate change. But of course, we could have chosen other images. And it's this idea of putting a frame around an image, a way of presenting an issue that's really important, but actually has real effects on the way that people, we engage with the issues in front of us and what we think about them. And I've taken this from the Frameworks Institute, which is a research institute that does a lot of work on framing. And they very helpfully put it like this. It's what is framing? It's about what we emphasize and how and what we explain, but it's also what we leave unsaid, what's outside the frame, or alternative images that could have been inside the frame. And when we change the story and how we tell it, and in this case, the story about climate change, we change the world, and we change the way people think and feel and engage with the world as well. So here's another picture that we could have shown or picked. You know, this is a very different one. This is about the kind of the technological side of it, but also potentially about the economic opportunities that adapting to climate change or responding to climate change or thinking about an alternative way of structuring society and the economy is that this would be a very different way of framing climate change and make people feel and think differently. Equally, we could have highlighted people rather than a desert or solar panels, and we could have emphasized the kind of the health aspect of climate change and the threat that it presents to us, rather than the economic opportunity that we just saw. Or finally, we could have framed something around the notion of time or urgency. Like, is this something that needs to be done now, or, you know, by a certain deadline, or further into the future? So there's lots of different dimensions. And what we wanted to do in this, in the paper that's behind this, which is collaborative research with co-authors in the UK and Germany, called Framing Climate Change, that we wanted to try and get these different dimensions all at once and try and understand which dimensions and which aspects were particularly important. And so we designed these experiments that we ran in China, Germany, India, the UK and the US with representative samples that were run in October last year. And we had about 1,500 people in each country. So overall, 7,500 people. And we got them to do what you've just done, amongst other questions, repeatedly, to try and understand which dimensions of a climate change message were more or less likely to make people choose to support changing climate policies. And so those 4 dimensions that you will have hopefully have seen already, one was we could present the climate change as a threat to be responded to, or actually an opportunity to be taken. People could talk about it as an environmental issue, an economic issue, a health issue, or a migration issue. They're all different ways of talking about climate change that are out there. And also, who does it matter, or who does it affect the most? Is it individuals? Is it our local community? Is it our country that we feel identify with as a citizen, or is it the world as a whole? And, you know, it'd be very interesting. Like, we speculated before we did this that we assumed that the personal or the individual level might be the most important. And so it's interesting to see whether that is the case or not. And also that final point about the urgency, is this something that needs to be done in 20 years or 30 years? I can't count that up, in 9 years or now. And so, as you see, all those messages randomly mixed up those different frames and presented them with some examples. And so I will hand over to Nahir now to talk us through what we found in the 5 countries. Oh, you can do that one too if you want, Nahir.
Great. So just just to before I talk about some of the results, so we used what's known as a conjoint design. So it's effectively a way of mixing all of those different themes that David mentioned, you know, around the policy theme, around the time frame, around the scale. We put it all together, and effectively, just as you received those statements which had aspects of all of those, our respondents in survey had the same thing, and effectively they would randomly get messages. So if we look at the statement A and statement B here, one is framed as a threat, the other is as an opportunity. One talks about health, one talks about migration. It talks about at the global level, actually both of them talk about the global level. They're talking about making things better or worse for the world. And they talk about the different timeframes in terms of right now or in the future. So that's effectively the type of statement that each of our respondents got pairs of statements, and they were asked to select between the two to choose which would make them more likely to support climate change, which is what we're going to focus on here and what we focus on in the paper. But we also asked them to put a monetary value to it as well. So then just to go through to the results. So this might look very, very complex, but actually it's fairly straightforward. So the dots that are lit up are the ones where there was a significant effect. And if it's on the right-hand side of the line, it means it's a positive effect. And if it's on the left-hand side, it's a negative effect. And so what we find so these are the results for each of the countries. So it's China, Germany, the UK, India, the US, and then the results at the end are the pooled results. So it's if we took them all together. So what does this tell us? So our results suggest overall, actually, the opportunity frame is much more effective than the threat frame. So framing climate change as an opportunity increases support in all of the countries, with the exception of Germany, which I'll come back to. But overall, we find, again, an opportunity framing climate change as an opportunity increases support. When we look at the different sort of policy themes, so we had a message that was based around the effects on the economy, a more traditional environmental message, a health-focused message, and a migration message. We find that the economic result, effectively the economic frame, doesn't have a significant effect anywhere. The environmental one, which has a positive effect, so it does increase support for climate change policies, climate policies, which is a little surprising in that very often people think that, when we talk about the environment, it's too abstract for people to really focus on, but we actually find it does have a positive effect. We find the health frame has a positive effect, which is really important. So framing climate change as a health issue increases support. And one that was particularly notable is that in all of the countries, when you frame climate change in terms of, potentially there might be an increase in climate migration and climate refugees, it has a negative effect. So it puts people off acting on climate change, or at least supporting policies on climate change. So effectively, environment and health have a positive effect, and migration has a negative effect, and economic has no real effect. The next set of results are around, what level are we talking about the effect that they have on you individually, on your community, on your country, or globally on the world. And we find in general, although in some of the countries this result isn't significant, in general we find actually the more global scale, the more people support, the more supportive people are of climate change. So framing this as a global issue increases support, whereas talking about people individually, so talking about how climate change might affect you individually, actually reduces support for climate change. So again, this, as David mentioned, it sort of goes contrary to what a lot of people might expect, in terms of, we tend to think of pitching things at the individual level of being far more effective, but we find the opposite. And then finally, in terms of the timeframes, we find, if you frame it as something that happens right now, that climate change is affecting us now, it increases support, whereas framing it as something that will have effects in 30 years time, decreases support, which actually we're not too surprised about. We expected that, I think. So those are the overall results. And so just summing those up, so opportunities work better, environmental and health frames have a positive effect, migration negative. And the larger the scale, so the more global the level that we're talking about, the more positive the effect, whereas the individual level has a negative effect. And the more immediate time frame has a bigger effect on increasing public support. However, there are important country differences. I mentioned the Germany result. We find, and actually it's worth saying that we actually did a pilot study in these countries as well. We got the same thing. So this isn't, we're pretty confident that this isn't just a random result that happened to show up. We found consistently that Germany is the only country of the 5 where actually framing climate change as a threat has a bigger effect on increasing support, whereas in every other country it was the positive opportunity framing that worked. And again, it's just worth noting, the environmental frame doesn't have an effect in the US, even though it works well in the other countries. The same with the scale. And whereas in the other countries, time frame mattered, it doesn't in China. And so it is important to note that while we do find some real similarities across the country, there are these important differences that we need to consider when we're trying to build that support for climate change. So then the other thing that we did is we also looked, as part of the survey experiment, we asked people the extent to which they are concerned about climate change. Obviously, many people care a lot and they're very concerned about climate change, but there are people who may be less concerned. And we were interested to know, how do you bring those people who might be less concerned, how do you bring them on board to support climate policies as well? So these results here just distinguish between those that are concerned about climate change and those not concerned. And again, some really interesting results. So as we might expect for the not concerned, most of the frames don't have an effect, but the frames that do have an effect are, having an opportunity, a positive frame. So framing climate change as an opportunity, whether it be economic or health or otherwise, even amongst those that are not concerned by climate change, they're willing to support those policies, which makes sense. And the other thing we find is that framing climate change as a health issue really, garner support amongst those that are not concerned otherwise about climate change. So yeah, opportunity and health matter, whereas again, migration has a very negative effect. It sort of pushes them even further away when you start talking about climate change as a migration issue. So those are the findings from the study, and I will hand over to Camilla.
Thanks, Nahir, and thanks for that summary. And I was commenting to David and Nahir before this event what an interesting paper it was to read. So thanks for sharing that. And it's definitely really interesting insights for me and a couple of projects I'm working on. So I'm just going to share my screen and show you a few slides. I introduced myself a little bit earlier, but I am International Partnerships Manager at the Natural History Museum in London. Much of that time has been about engaging our audiences with our collections and our scientific research. For the past year, I've been in this specific role, which is thinking a lot more globally. So really thinking about this mission that we have to create advocates for the planet. How can we do that outside of museum walls, beyond the UK, and engage with audiences globally? And honestly, it's no exaggeration to say that working in the museum has changed me and how I see the world and issues like climate change. So moving on about the NHM, just 60 seconds. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the NHM. I'm biased, of course, but I think this is one of the most beautiful buildings in London. We opened in 1881. We have a collection of about 80 million specimens, everything you can imagine from meteorites from space, fish, dinosaurs. Our botanical collection is about 6 million strong. We also have 300 scientists based at the museum conducting their own research, but also looking after the collections and making them accessible for scientific research and study across the world. And increasingly, we are, much like many other museums, we're turning our attention to engaging our audiences with these very pressing issues like climate change. I snuck this picture in purely because it's probably my favorite gallery in the museum. The photo doesn't do it justice, but it's one of those galleries that's basically remained unchanged since the NHM opened, including some of those cabinets as well. So we're discussing climate change and how it's framed today. And so I wanted to mention something that's quite pertinent to that with respect to our museum, and that's our new-ish strategy. I won't spend too long on this, but we commissioned a public perception survey a few months before lockdown towards the end of 2019. And we were hearing really strongly from our young audiences that they wanted more from our museum in terms of addressing, discussing and hearing solutions to these big global challenges we're facing. Much like climate change, of course, is a central one. And this really helped inform our strategy, and it puts the planetary emergency absolutely front and center, states really clearly that we're having this unprecedented destructive impact on our planet, and we need an unprecedented response if we're going to have any kind of habitable future, and outlines this vision for a future where people and planet thrive, and a mission to create advocates for the planet. And I guess a sentence that sticks out to me in strategy as someone who's worked in engaging public audiences is that knowledge and understanding from scientific discovery is really vital, and it's the backbone of what we do, but it's not sufficient. That engagement and meaningful engagement is really key. So we're thinking more and more about the most meaningful and impactful ways of engaging our audiences with these very complicated, nuanced issues like climate change. So what do we know about how our audiences engage with climate change as a subject? We're very lucky that we have an audience research team at the NHM. A lot of museums don't. And we've generally found that people are more likely to respond to positive stories around climate change. So for example, explaining the issue clearly, but providing stories that focus on solutions or efforts to stop the damage. And in many ways, I think this resonates really well with the research that David and Nahir have been talking about in terms of framing of the opportunities that feel more positive than threats. We've also found that when talking about climate change, it really needs to feel relevant and have a clear message without feeling too daunting. Again, perhaps relating to this concept of threats not being a huge motivator, except in Germany, perhaps. And we've also found that who speaks about these issues is really important to heighten the chances of the message landing. So the messenger, if you like, is maybe a term that you've heard before. We found that voices of people on the ground, whether they are scientists or local groups, resonates more than voices that feel too institutional, too far away, or removed from the issues discussed. And we've been reminded that people may consider climate change a big issue, but it might not be top of their priority lists above, say, paying the bills, spending time with loved ones, and so on. So I also wanted to briefly mention something we created to think about how we're communicating with our audiences more effectively on these issues is this framework that we've called the advocate engagement model. You might not be able to read that so well, but basically it's this kind of step-by-step approach starting from the bottom. So when we say visitor charter, it's just making sure that people feel comfortable and welcome, whether that's physically into our building or engaging with us online. And then the next 3 steps are really kind of the key ones. So inspire, and we always kind of refer to this Attenborough quote, which I think is really relevant. So he said, no one will protect what they don't care about, and no one will care about what they have never experienced. So we realized that we need to create a relevant and memorable experiences that help people connect with nature on an emotional level. In terms of inform, we recognize that we need to provide information to help people place themselves within the story of our planet so they can see themselves in this role in nature and its future. And with respect to empower, that we need to provide people with the confidence, the skills, the motivation, the knowledge, and the opportunity to make a difference, whether that's opportunities at the museum or making more informed personal choices for change themselves. And I think this is also about recognizing that people are going to come to us or engage with us at different places on that spectrum or journey. You know, a lot of people come to the museum not really to learn about climate change or hear about that stuff. They just want to see a dinosaur or see stuffed animals. Like, I don't know if you can see, that's my niece in the bottom left corner there. And they maybe don't think or perhaps know much about climate change. And that's really fine, because to us, these things are the hook. They're the points of inspiration in the natural world. They're the gateway to having those sorts of conversations with people. So start by caring, then wanting to feel informed, and then feeling empowered to want to do something. So I'll just say something brief about how we've talked about climate change in the time I've been at the museum and how things are shifting. Firstly, in terms of permanent galleries, our museum is largely arranged taxonomically, birds here, mammals there, and it doesn't really speak to our audiences. We're in the middle of planning some significant changes, predominantly because we want our narratives and storytelling in those spaces to feel relevant and compelling to visitors so they can place themselves in the story. And I'll show you, I mean, this is naughty of me, but I'll show you some areas where they're really in need of a bit of an update. And I guess you'll see why. So I don't actually know when this went up, but you can see there's some really dated language in there that just doesn't really speak to people. So there's talk of chlorofluorocarbons in there. I mean, I think all the Montreal Protocol stuff was years ago now. It doesn't feel particularly relevant for people. There's a question mark after changing climate. We also have a climate change wall, where there's a focus on the impact of climate change on different environments. It talks about the work our scientists are doing and what the collections can tell us. But the language still feels really dated. It's still got that polar bear image. It talks about computer modeling. There's no real solutions or call to action. And we're hearing this back from our visitors that they don't feel particularly inspired. So in the past couple of years, we've thought more about our audiences, where they're coming from, and trying to meet them where they are. So one example, I don't really have a particular picture of it, but we commissioned a theatre performance for one of our lates, which was called How to Save the World. And it was really basic. It had 2 performers on stage, and they depicted or acted out these different scenarios, as diverse as 2 people at a house party in Clapton, talking about veganism, to a smallholder farm in Indonesia threatened by palm oil plantations. But the point was that the actors painted these different pictures and showed that people have different priorities depending on where you are in the story. And they actively encouraged audiences to use their voice to participate and really be part of that discussion. So the audiences could guide the actions and conversations delivered by the performers. And I guess I really loved it because it showed our audiences that there are nuanced complexities around climate change, that there are trade-offs and compromises, and also really highlighted the importance of this social science understanding of what motivates people and what turns them on and off. And in the past year, we've had a program focusing on a younger audience specifically, and we've really thought about considering who they want to hear from, who they trust, where they feel there is representation, etc. So in this program, we've purposely invited collaborations with young, diverse people from countries across the world, from Bali to the Philippines to Uganda to the US, with powerful storytelling abilities and showing incredible leadership. So again, it was really interesting to hear Nihir's reflections on the research there in terms of the impact of painting a more global picture and telling more global stories. And just this slide is a couple of pictures from COP26. So we did a couple of Instagram lives with a young Indigenous environmentalist from India. And we went to the climate protests on the streets of Glasgow. And this is just the kind of stuff that an old bureaucratic museum like ours wouldn't have been doing a year or two ago. And finally, this is a project I'm leading on at the moment and how I know Nihir. So this is a partnership project between our museum and the Museum for the United Nations, or UN Live. If you're not familiar with them, they formed in about 2015. They're all about using culture to connect with people where they are, to mobilize, I think their end target by 2050, don't quote me on that, is to motivate 1 billion people to take action in line with the Sustainable Development Goals. But this is a Wellcome funded project. It's a 1-year R&D project, which is going to inform an application for a multi-year partnership grant. And it's all about public engagement with climate change and health. And it's a bit of an experiment across 5 different countries. So Brazil, China, England, India, and Nigeria. And we want to see if we can bring unlikely partners together to create these engagement ideas that will reinforce those interconnections between climate change and health. And a key thing we wanted to discover, and again, this is why the research has been so interesting for us, is whether framing climate change impacts through this lens of health, we can engage people with experiences that feel a bit more personal, tangible, and immediate to ultimately drive action. So it's really encouraging to hear that the health framing was shown to have positive effects. And actually it included 3 parts of the world that we are working in. So that was great to hear. The other thing I'll quickly say about this project, a key thing about it is we also, alongside the health framing, we want to know if by leveraging culture, so when I say culture, we're looking at things like stand-up comedy, creative social media content, sport, whether that's a great way to meet people where they are and use that kind of vehicle to convey these complex challenges in a language that people already speak, in a space that they're already super passionate about. And it reminds me of, so Nihir very kindly took part in a podcast episode with us for this project, and it was alongside a young climate justice activist from the Philippines. And in terms of framing, I thought she said something quite interesting, which was that, young people, how many of them actually want to read the IPCC report? Not loads, but actually if you took everything in that report and you turned it into a comic or a graphic novel, or, you changed the way that you communicated that information to make it feel more relevant and personal, then it could go a long way. So yeah, I will finish there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm still doing the analysis in the background, so I think we should open it up for the Q&A. And Nihir, if you would kindly chair this, I would be really appreciated.
Absolutely. So yeah, if I'm actually not sure on this call how the questions, if you either want to post your questions, I guess, into the chat would be, yeah, if you can post any questions that you have for the panel, or any comments you want to make, please do so in the chat, and we will take a couple at a time. So given we're waiting for a few people to start with the questions, I'll start with a question for Camilla then, which is, have you faced much in the way of pushback in this? Oh, sorry. I'll save my question because there are already questions. I missed the box. Okay, so we've got a question from David. Any ideas about why the national difference? Not really, actually. I mean, I think it's just, I mean, I think there are probably, for example, just taking the German case, I think, you know, it is important to recognize that there are people are used to different styles of messaging based on, you know, the socialization that they've had within their country. It might be that they're used to messages coming a certain way. There might be linguistic differences in the way things translate in terms of what we've translated as a threat and an opportunity. I think there's just, yeah, there's a whole range of reasons why those differences might exist in terms of but no, we're curious about those as well. I don't know, Camilla, if you've got if based on some of the work you've done, you've found clear differences in the way, you know, different actors around the world engage with climate change or not, or different types of messages, or maybe.
Sorry, I was looking to respond to a question that I could see was about the Welcome Project. What were you specifically?
Just whether based on some of the work you've done in terms of audiences and engaging, particularly now that you're doing stuff with a global audience, whether you see whether you see differences and clear trends in terms of certain ways in which people from some countries might engage with climate change versus others, or is it that actually you find that there's far more similarity in that?
I mean, so I should mention that part of the project that I mentioned right at the very end there, the Welcome funded one, My Body, My Planet, the countries, sorry, there's a question in the chat. The countries are Brazil, China, England, India, and Nigeria. So part of that project is we are also working with an audience research company to disseminate these public perception surveys in each of those countries, although we are focusing actually on 18 to 24-year-olds. And so actually here, we don't have this wealth of information at the moment, and it's partly why Welcome and we were really excited for these surveys. Like through these surveys, we're looking to inquire, like get that base level information about how these young people feel about climate change, how much they understand it, how much they feel it's a threat, who they feel is kind of responsible for taking action. And so we're really excited to get these results because we just haven't, apart from desk-based research, we haven't seen a huge amount from other countries. So yeah.
So in short, yeah, we're not sure, and it's definitely something we want to look at a bit further, I guess, across all of our work. We've an anonymous attendee has asked about whether the research has been published, and a DOI. It hasn't been published. It's currently under review, but there is a preprint, a sort of rough draft, and we've rewritten it, but there is a rough draft version available online. So I'm just going to post that there. So yeah, it's preprint, but the actual final version is still currently under review. So hopefully it will be published soon. Have you done any regional analysis within the UK? If so, what are the main results? I haven't, but because David, although David might be busy doing the analysis, but I know David has done lots of UK focused work looking at attitudes to climate change. And I imagine Camilla, maybe, I don't know if you know of sort of regional differences or anything that has been done at the museum around different parts of the UK and whether there are different sort of ways of audiences engaging.
No, unfortunately. We are part of a network of museums that span the UK. I don't know of any specific work they've done to ask these questions, without find out if that's something people are interested in.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. Actually, it's definitely something for research going forward in terms of because certainly in different areas of looking at climate change development, there are regional differences in the UK. And I know if David wasn't otherwise occupied, I'm sure he'd be able to speak to that a bit more. But yeah, no, so we don't know of that particular analysis, I'm afraid. But it's a good question. And it's probably something we should look into a bit more. Jennifer asks, she says, I'm curious why you chose the image for the presentation, given the importance of your presentation to focus on opportunities. I think that's a very good point. And I did not select it, but I think it is, let's say it was there to show why we should move away from that sort of imagery, then it's an example of what people often do and probably shouldn't do, I guess, is the best possible answer. But you're right, it is. I remember a similar thing. We had a colleague who's written about aid and how negative the sort of messaging and imagery around aid is, and then the front cover of his book, that the publisher chose exactly the type of image he didn't want. So I think I think there's a lot to be said for us all thinking a bit more about some of these images and the ways we communicate with our own research as well. No other questions yet. If anyone's got other questions, please do.
Nahir, I'm happy to answer a question that I think I've seen come through. If the NHM changes its approach away from taxonomy more towards narratives and stories, will the displays get out or be too subject to our current opinions and knowledge? That's a really good question. Okay, so I guess let me clarify. So the way that we work and the way that our science is done, and the way that we organize our collections and so on, the way that all of that is done is absolutely staying the same, and our scientific research has always been our background and will continue to be. I guess what I mean is we're looking at some of those permanent gallery spaces. So some people love them. They're quite traditional in their approach. So the Birds Gallery, for example, is super popular. You have the specimen, you have the interpretation label, which is, I think in the Birds Gallery, the common name and the scientific name, which is great. And some people love that. At the same time, we're hearing feedback that, we talk a lot about biodiversity at the NHM and how important biodiversity understanding and conservation is, but people aren't really getting that feeling of interconnected ecosystems and so on as they're walking through the galleries. So at the same time as some people loving it, and believe me, people take multiple selfies and that's great, we're also getting this feedback of like, these stories don't really resonate in your spaces. But that's a really good point. Like, we want something that can stand the test of time, but I think we're just thinking more and more about drawing people into the stories of these natural systems and how we can remind people that we are very much a part of nature and not just the outside looking in and extracting from these natural systems. So it will be a bit of a balance, but we're just looking to engage people a little bit differently.
Sorry, I've just seen that there are quite a few more questions in the chat. I've sort of been looking at the Q&A, and there's also questions in the chat. So Tamira asks, how would this research translate into policy? So how does theoretical support translate into action? It's a really good question. So with this particular research, I mean, in response to one of the previous questions, I posted a link to a draft version of the paper, and the reason we put that up actually was because we were presenting this work to various policy audiences, and they did want to use it, and so we sort of had to write that version quite quickly just to put it up so that they could engage with it. And the way different policy audiences have engaged, so the main one that was very excited for obvious reasons about this was the World Health Organization, who have a team that focuses on climate change, and they've been trying to push this message for ages that we need to move away from these very abstract notions of how climate change, how many gigatons and all of these metrics that people don't really engage with, to thinking about the health impacts and mortality and how the spread of diseases. And so they, for example, have used the research to then justify building a strategy going into COP to have a much bigger presence and to really push the case for focusing on health. And so that would be one example. Similarly with the NHS, who are increasingly engaged with, so the Greener NHS team is there to try to decarbonize the health system in the UK. And again, they've also got a team that focuses on communications, and who have been really keen to sort of use these findings to emphasize the need to focus more on health when we're talking about climate change. More generally, it might be we presented this work to a UK government team. It was a sort of cross-departmental team that was responsible for a lot of the COP planning. And again, it's a case of it's not always clear whether this, like, our research will immediately have impact or even have any impact, but it's certainly a case of sort of presenting that, them being open to hearing what we have to say and thinking about, the use of threats versus opportunities, the use of, because again, there was an argument made by some, which is, when people learn about the potential for lots of climate migrants, because it's migration is such a big political issue in the UK. It would spur more action, and our research suggests it doesn't actually. People see through it as being quite opportunistic, and so that's at least my interpretation, is that actually people see it for being quite a negative and cynical way to try to engage people. So that's some of the ways. It's mainly for us trying to present, and different groups then hopefully taking on some of that research, and us being willing to present that research. Camilla, maybe you can say something about how, given you work with scientists and with audiences, how research does translate into policy, or into the ways in which you act.
Yeah, a great question. I think so. The museum definitely has an ambition to kind of, I suppose, be in that space a little bit more. So we are actually going to have an area of our department that is a bit more focused on policy. So we have this new tool. I don't know so much about it, but it's the Biodiversity Trends Explorer. And it basically aims to be this kind of tool which hopefully will inform some policymaking decisions around areas of biodiversity that need to be protected, around access to biodiverse areas. And this is, I think, that's only been launched very recently. And this is something that we're really, really pushing, because I think some people, for example, they don't really know the intersections of climate change and biodiversity, may not feel so switched on to exactly what biodiversity is and why we need it, why we depend upon it. So I think in terms of pushing things into that policy space, biodiversity is super key for us, and that's an example of. I'll find a link and pop it in the chat in case people are interested in terms of influencing policy for us.
We have a couple of questions, and I see David is looking up, so maybe he can also answer. So we have a couple of questions. Does age make a difference? If I'm right, it doesn't. And does there was another question linked to subgroups. What does religion? I think there was a question on religion as well. Oh, how do you feel that people of faith responded to, oh, maybe that's a more general question actually from Harriet, but David, I think I'm right in saying age didn't actually make a difference in terms of how they engage, right? Yeah, so not really. There weren't, I think education was the only factor that mattered in terms of, breaking it down into subgroups based on education or income or age. Yeah, and gender didn't matter either. Harriet's got a question, which is, why do you think it's the positive messaging that makes people want to take action? Is it because people feel guilty? It's a really good question. David, do you want to, given you've insight, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I'm just trying to find it. Positive messaging, is it because people feel guilty? Yeah, maybe. I suppose it's an empirical question. It's something that we could try and find out, not from the data that we have, but from future work. I know that in a kind of a parallel field around supporting development cooperation, giving aid, etc., that guilt can be, and different forms of engagement, whether people choose to personally donate money or volunteer, that guilt can be a positive driver, as in it can make people more likely, but it can also shut people down or just engage transactionally to assuage their guilt and then not really make other changes to their lifestyle. So I honestly don't know what the answer would be for us, but it is interesting that guilt is a driving force in other kind of similar areas, but can work in either way.
So some of the other climate change literature, which has looked at things like positive and negative, I think in general it's just a sense that it can be very overwhelming to think about the climate crisis and all of the ways and the scale of the response that's needed, and often the messages we get coming out of things like the COP meeting that happened in Glasgow are quite negative, and it's never quite enough. And I think emphasizing those negatives does make people also feel quite helpless in terms of how they respond, and they feel that there is very little that they can do, which in itself sort of puts people off from engaging or wanting to act. And actually that positive framing, that way of showing there is action that we can take, and B, there are lots of benefits of taking that action. I think again it's so personally, and again, this, as David said, it's an empirical question, but just personally, I sort of feel it's more to do with motivating people. And, you know, if we think too hard about what's needed and all the negative effects and just focus on that negative news, it's really overwhelming. And, you know, there is a sense of which, you know, there's very little we can do. And it's about sort of, yeah, showing that actually all around the world. And as Camilla's pointed out, with, you know, she's engaged with lots of really interesting activists from the work that she's been doing, and on that podcast it was great listening to them. You know, there are people taking action all around the world, and being reminded of that sort of helps us feel that we can be part of that as well.
If I can quickly, if it's okay to quickly comment off the back of that, the two things we definitely heard that loud and clear when we had a coral reefs exhibition in 2015, and a really key piece of audience feedback was, so obviously in the exhibition we had beautiful displays, we talked about bleaching, of course, and we did have a panel which talked about solutions and actions, and we had a really strong message back from our audience that they just wanted more of that, and that they engaged with it, they were emotionally connected, but they just found it a little bit depressing, and that there was like a small panel, it wasn't enough. They wanted more options for solutions, they wanted to hear more of those stories. And what we've really found through our work in the past year with this public program I mentioned with young people from different corners of the world is that there are these amazing solution stories, like local solution stories, that are actually completely inspirational and incredible, but they just don't hit the headlines as much as these sort of doom and gloom ones do. And I think people can find that a little bit hard. So yeah, that'd be my take on it.
David, jump in when you feel we need to switch over.
Yeah, no, I can do it at any point now. It's ready.
Okay, well, we'll take a couple more because there's some great questions.
I think so. Yeah.
David's responded to Tamira, but it is a really, really good question, which is, you know, was there a difference between people who were sort of more engaged by the threats versus the opportunities? You know, how would this affect behavioral change? I think it's a great question. We don't know the answer to it, but it's really interesting to think about, you know, are there other differences between those that respond more to that notion of the threat that climate change poses versus the opportunities? So we don't know, but yeah, really, really interesting question. So Camilla, you've responded to the question on the countries, but it might be worth, just because I think it's really interesting, because I was vaguely involved in some of the conversations with you about how you came up with those countries. And I think it's a really interesting question in terms of, you know, why those particular countries?
Yeah, gosh, conversation was so long ago now. So I guess there are so many countries that you can involve in a project like this, because yeah, that's for real, climate change impacts almost in every country I can imagine. So I guess there are a few things that we considered. We considered a geographical spread, of course, and not focusing too much on one continent. We looked at countries that had significant emissions, or at least their population was kind of really on that kind of upward trajectory. Their economy was on that trajectory, and it was looking like their emissions were very likely to increase. Places where we could reach a large proportion of our kind of target audience, that 18 to 24-year-old, a very loose term of middle class, I suppose. Obviously that's nuanced and has different implications for different countries, but the people who perhaps have the time, consumer choice, who have the capacity and autonomy to take some kind of action to use their voice, but might not be doing so already. And then there was a little final thing thrown in, which was about pre-existing relationships as well, and having the opportunity to make connections in these places fairly swiftly, because it's crazy how, a year-long R&D project can just sail by incredibly fast. So, yeah.
Harriet's got a question on how do you feel that people of faith have responded to the climate crisis, which again, I think is a great question. A colleague of ours based at the University of York, Hilary Graham, who does lots of really amazing work around health and climate change. I know it's something she's been looking into in terms of at least how you engage, and how do faith-based groups engage with climate change, and what does that mean for how we should think about how to engage people. But beyond that, I mean, there has clearly been a response. We see it from the Pope, we see it from various religious groups. We've seen a strong sort of message on the need to address climate change. But in terms of more generally, I don't really know. I don't know if David or Camilla, you've got any experiences or anything on sort of faith and...
Not on this, but I think more generally thinking about the role of faith, it's underplayed. People don't make enough of it. and one can appeal very effectively to those moral principles that people hold. And we've seen it before in big campaigns like 21 years ago with the Jubilee campaign and Drop the Debt. That was obviously framed in some communities in very religious terms, and actually very effectively engaged people who would be otherwise pretty opposed to that kind of effort. So they've got Senator Jesse Helms in my head as an example. So yeah, I do think there's probably more to be done there to think about how to describe what's happening in terms that resonate with people who have religious faith. Yeah.
And more generally, so the work I mentioned that Hilary is doing at York, I mean, it's more generally about, there is a sense at least, so those of you, and I'm sure that's many of you that are super engaged with climate change issues and climate change communications, that typically the messaging or the sort of, the main groups involved are sort of, your liberal left who aren't necessarily particularly religious, and the messaging is always framed around issues of justice and that sort of thing. And there has been an effort, and this is partly what Hilary's work with a few of us is looking at, is, what about conservative voters? Is there a way to think about what climate change means in terms of our natural heritage that might be a more salient sort of message than the typical frames that we often see at the moment? And the same as Harriet sort of mentioned, and what about those religious groups? How do we engage them? What sorts of messages actually do resonate much more? And we need to start thinking about some of these differences, and not simply appealing to those that are like us is part of the message for the climate change community.
Do you mind if, oh sorry, I don't want to.
No,
I realized we're short on time, so I don't want to. I was just going to quickly comment. I can't find it now, but someone put something in the chat that was relating to this, the concept of behavior change. A comment that one aspect of this Wellcome funded project, My Body, My Planet. So we're working closely with a behaviour science organisation, and I'm just finding it incredibly, it's super interesting because this is an R&D year, and we're looking to do, obviously, to learn and gain insights to inform a much larger proposal for a longer project. We're thinking about what this really means in terms of action, behaviour change and impact and that sort of thing. And we're not expecting to change any behaviour in a very low fidelity cultural prototype test that we're doing this year. But what we're interested in doing is seeing whether we can do things like encourage people to pause or assess where they might have biases, or encourage them to reflect before they make a judgment on something, consider their actions first. And what we're hearing from the behaviour science organisation is very interesting with respect to the kinds of mental models that people have when they encounter a situation. And so they were talking to us, I'm going to get this wrong, so I'll skip over it briefly, but they talked about these two different systems whereby you have one that involves a lot more mental effort and investment to understand an issue, to make an informed decision on an action, and another that's almost kind of subconscious, and there's a way of kind of nudging people into taking a certain action or changing a behavior where they're not investing all of that time and energy in understanding something, but they're still performing this action. But then the latter doesn't have the same impact in the former in terms of going on to talk about it to other people, or going on to adopt other actions and stuff. So at the moment, we're making these really interesting decisions about what we push for, whether it's something quick and subconscious and more easy to adopt, but still great impact, but without having that lasting effect of people really being invested in the issues and then therefore taking things a step further. So it's a bit messy and complicated, but it's completely fascinating, I think.
Well, thank you for the question. There's been some really great questions, actually. I'm going to hand over to David to report back. So.
Yeah, hopefully you can see that. Sorry, this is done on the fly and there was something wrong with the coding. Anyway, fixed. So what we can see here is amongst the those of you in the room who completed this survey, and thank you, we actually see that you're found more compelling the threat. So there's obviously a lot of Germans in the participants here. That's the only inference I can draw, but that's interesting. So that's a very consistent finding. In terms of the different themes, so here we see the health theme is clearly the most important in terms of positively affecting people to choose those messages that had health in there. And I think although they're all negative because the health is so strong, the relative importance of economy, environment, and migration mirrors a little bit kind of where they were. Migration isn't punished quite so much amongst the people present here tonight. In terms of the scale, this is interesting. It's almost the same, going from personal up to the world, except for country. Those of you who felt that the country was going to be affected the most are the ones that those messages tended to get chosen more frequently than our samples from the other countries. And then again here, I think that's just probably on the edge of statistical significance, that the now message is the most compelling one, and certainly out of the three of them, it's more likely to be chosen. So apart from the opportunity and threat, and maybe the country thing, this looks more or less similar, but a couple of important differences. So thank you everybody for participating in that, and hopefully doing that at the beginning actually makes what myself and Nahir were trying to explain around how we do this much more easy to grasp once you've seen it and had a go at it yourself. So thank you very much for doing that, and we really appreciate it. And all of the questions as well, and the great discussion. It was really excellent. So if anyone would like the last word, now is the opportunity. Otherwise, I'd just like to thank Louise, who has been behind the scenes and making sure that everything works, which we actually needed. So thank you, Louise. Also, thank you very much to Camilla for coming along and talking about her experience and knowledge on this issue, and sharing kind of the implementation side of things, where the rubber hits the road. Thank you to Nahir, as ever, not only for presenting the findings, but jumping in and taking over the Q&A, and you did it much better than I would. So thank you very much. And finally, thank you to everybody for coming tonight. We really appreciated it and enjoyed your company, and we very much liked those questions, and they've given us a lot of things to think about. Louise has just put a very short link to a very short evaluation form in the chat. So if you wouldn't mind, if you had a few minutes just to fill that in, we'd really appreciate it, because it helps us reflect on the material that we're presenting and how we present it more generally across the festival. So that would be great. And finally, thank you everybody for coming along tonight. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening, and hopefully we'll see you somewhere sometime soon. Take care, everyone. Night night.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.